voy a hablar de los seres vivientes, porque me gustan, esencialmente. Un ser viviente como este, puedes ver acá, son muy impresionantes, pero quizás no en la forma en que se imaginan que son impresionantes. Somos seres vivientes y esencialmente somos lo mismo que estos tipos. Y estos dos son muy peculiares para nosotros, porque they involve a mystery, and they share with us the mystery of existence. And I would like to say something about that. Then we're going to be this way.
Let's see how much of this we can do. First, living beings, then sociality, then cause and codification, then the parrots. Very important for me, the parrots. Language and
Seres vivientes, lenguaje y conciencia. No sé qué lenguaje estoy hablando. No sé si voy a estar hablando en inglés o en qué estoy. No sé en qué. Voy a tratar de ir en español. ¿Ya? Voy a hacer lo mejor para leerlo en español. ¿Ya?
Cuando uno se encuentra con los seres vivos,
when you find and encounter living beings, you meet singular entities that can be characterized and that have been characterized by certain properties that are outstanding and visible, that confer them the distinctive quality of being different from others. And that has to do with two dimensions of the living being's existence. One with the dynamics existence. Living beings, when you find a living being, you find an entity which is discrete, that defines its own limits, that it's in continuous transformation, structural transformation, as Professor Cuvier from 19th century says, that is in a continuous structural transformation and interaction with the surroundings. And which is interesting also is that these interaction worlds is not coherent, or interactions are not coherent with the surroundings. The living beings is disintegrated. But there's something else that is very outstanding, which is autonomy. Living beings change from their own, and the way of changing they have has to do with their own existing ways. There are no strengths or pressures or determining factors that specify the direction of the changes that they experience. Living beings are autonomous. They are in a continuous change, and the direction of the change has to do with their own existence. Now, being autonomous in their own existence and in interactions in a specific context, living beings exist in the action. They are continuously acting. They are in a flow of actions. And if the flow of actions is detained, is stopped, living beings are disintegrated. The direction of that flow of action depends on the way of their existence. And that is very singular and peculiar, because there's something here I would like to point out that is very badly pointed out. You don't see it well, but it's really relevant. I think I'm going to put it here.
Yes, right. Thank you.
Yes, si podía ampliar la mano. So,
Spanish, español.
Okay, español. You can see
Spanish then. Okay, Spanish. Pueden ver acá.
Pueden ver aquí.
You can see here the crossword. The crossword is the best example I have found to tell you what I want to show you. There's this crossword, right? And there's nothing there. Unless I read. I'm reading in Spanish and it says egos. And it's, if I read it backwards, delirium and heel or pipe. What is interesting is that if this crossword is the surrounding of the existence, what happens is that the act of reading, the action, constitutes what is being read. It doesn't say anything there unless you read it. And reading is an action that a living being does in that surrounding. And the interesting thing is that from that action an object arises. And it happens that objects with which living beings interact, those action objects, arise from actions. And that is a condition, that is a constitutive condition of living beings' existence. There is no objects, there are no objects, unless there is an action that configures objects. And once this object is configured, it's a source of disturbances of this living being that has actually enacted this constitution action. So the object becomes a source of disturbance and change for the living being, and it contributes to specify the changing dynamics of their states of this living being that is going to experiment during the whole existence. And this is like an athlete that is doing some exercises in a space given, a mattress, the exercise mattress at the stadium, but the context, the floor, and the context of her existence, or his is a kind of a spring where it takes impulse to change. Living beings, they get impulse from the medium, changing themselves. There are no objects there. The objects are constituted by the actions. And once they are constituted, we act on them and upon them, upon those objects. And this is an important thing, or relevant, because I want to show you something now. Let's suppose that we're looking at social living beings, which are very interesting for one reason. I'm going to show you a figure I did for a class time ago, and it's a bit messy, but I think it's going to illustrate what I want to say. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going to share another screen. There, can you see this? Social living beings are very interesting because in the context of their own existence, in the space of existence, supposedly they have interactions with other living beings. So what happens here, this is here, it meets this one, and there's a space for interaction between them, so that the interactions that occur between these beings have consequences regarding the way each one of them is in their own surroundings. So it's interesting to see this, because from the point of view of this one, the action of this one in relation to this one is an object, that is the object of this action. And this object of this action now, it's the reference for other actions that this does in a context what is not a social context, or not necessarily the social context. It can be the surroundings where both are doing their own things, where both are existing. And this is interesting because you can see the flow of the existence. This goes to the reproductive moment, but it doesn't get to this stage unless he coordinates or converse or talk about his actions with the other. And what you see here is a coordination of action, a dance of coordination of actions, where one, with respect to the other, coordinate. In this meeting, they coordinate their actions according to themselves and according to the context of the surroundings. And this can lead to an interesting situation where these living beings could distinguish their interaction as objects of action, for action too.
Vamos a ver eso en un momento más.
Let's have a look at this in a moment.
Lo que
Now,
ocurre con
this
esto es que si
what
esto
happens
tiene
here
intensidad
is that
suficiente, y
if
ocurre
this
así
has an
en
intensity,
los seres vivos
certain
cuya
intensity,
existencia
and it
depende de la
happens to the
socialidad,
living
y
beings
en
where
muchos
they
de ellos
depend on
ocurre así,
social
en centros
interaction, and in
sociales,
many
por
of the
ejemplo.
living
Si yo
beings
estoy
occur.
mirando, nosotros miramos esta
If
situación,
we're looking
vamos a
at this
encontrar
situation,
dos
we
dominios,
find that
hay
there
dos
are two
dominios de acción que están,
specific
se dan
action
cuenta ustedes,
domains.
aquí hay dos dominios
If
de
you look
acción
at
que
this,
están
there are two
imbricados.
action domains
El
that
dominio
are
de acción
hybrid.
es entre ellos.
The
Y el
between
dominio de
them, the
acción
actions
es
between
de
them
cada
and
uno
the
de ellos
actions
con respecto al mundo.
of each
Si
one
esa
of them
tiene
together,
intensidad suficiente,
each one of them
ustedes van a poder
according to the
describir
world.
eso en
If this
términos
is
semánticos.
intense enough, you can define this in semantic ways.
Ocurre que le dijo que hiciera esto.
He said,
Le dijo que hiciera esto
he
otro,
said
como la abejita
him
en el panal.
to say that,
La abeja
like the bee in
vuela,
the
encuentra las flores, vuelve al panal
the
y
bee
ejecuta una
flies
danza.
comes back and
Y la
it
consecuencia de
executes a
esa danza es
dance,
que las otras abejas
and
que
the
están en el
consequence as
entorno
the other
de esta,
bees that
dispuestas
are
de
in
una
the
manera, en
place
una configuración
together
peculiar respecto de la que
in the
danza,
hive
modifican
in
el
a
flujo de su
specific
conducta y su flujo de
place,
acción,
they
de modo
modify
tal que
their
ahora
own
salen del panal en una
behavior. Now they
dirección,
go
en una
out of the
dirección,
hive
y queda
in a
especificada
direction where
en
it's
ella
specific in their
por
own
la danza,
living
por su
being because of
participación
the
en la danza
dance
que
or
la
the
otra realiza.
participation in the dance of the
Y cuando
other
ustedes
one
ven eso, van
who
a
initially
distinguir
danced.
dos
And when you see
dominios.
these, you
El
will
dominio de la
distinguish two
coordinación de
domains:
acción y el dominio de
coordination
las
of
acciones
actions
coordinadas.
and coordinated
Y si esto
actions
tiene
on
la
the other
riqueza
side.
suficiente,
And this,
ustedes
if
van a
being
poder
rich
describir
enough,
entonces
you
una
will be
situación
able to distinguish a situation
una situación en términos
um,
semánticos.
in
Hay-
terms of semantic concepts.
Hay
There is
signos y significados.
signs and significant meanings, signs and meanings. The interactions between themselves constitute references for the later course of their own actions. And if this is intense and regular, you will be able to extract instants from that dance and relate those specific posture between these bugs has these consequences in the subsequent behavior they have, which takes me to the next aspect I wanted to touch upon, is the situation of codes or coding. When you talk about codes and when you talk about coding, I want to take this.
Because I am going too fast, I am going fast in order to make it in fast.
Estoy yendo muy rápido.
Codes and codification. That is
Códigos y codificación.
es interesante también notar eso.
It is also interesting to notice
Por
that.
ejemplo, grafías,
For example, graphs.
y
Graphs.
fonemas.
And phonemes. Graphic
Cada
signs and
signo
phonemes.
gráfico
Each graphic
corresponde
sign
a
corresponds
una
to
vocalización.
vocalization of some
Interesante lo que ocurre
type.
cuando
That's
alguien
very
lee un
interesting what
texto.
happens when
Supongamos
you
que
read a text.
podemos
Someone reads a
imaginar,
text.
y eso
Let's
es
suppose that
interesante,
we can
es
imagine.
interesante, que es imaginar.
And that's an
Voy a
interesting,
tratar
which
de
is
describirlo
imagine.
en un momento más.
I'm going to talk about that
Supongamos,
a bit later.
imaginemos
Let's
que
imagine
recibimos un texto,
that we receive a
un
text,
libro de regalo, de
a
cumpleaños.
book.
¿Y qué
It's a
hace un
gift
señor
for a
cuando lee?
birthday.
Cualquiera
And
de
what you
nosotros,
do,
bueno,
a person
desliza
when
sus
you
ojos
read,
de una manera
you just
secuencial y direccional
take
sobre
your eyes
una
from one place
cantidad
to the
de
other in a
signos,
sequential way on a number of
gráficos, de
symbols,
grafías,
graphic signs,
manchas en el papel. Y
dots in the
mientras hace
paper.
eso,
And
ríe,
while you do that,
llora, se
you
asusta,
laugh, you cry, you get
se
scared,
entristece, se
you get
alegra,
sad,
y finalmente
get
cambia
happy,
su-
and
su
finally
existencia.
you change the
Como
flow of your
consecuencia
own
de
existence.
deslizar
As a
los
consequence of
ojos
this
secuencial y
going of your
direccionalmente
eyes
sobre
in
una
a
serie de
sequential and
grafías.
directional way from following a certain path of graphic signs.
Sí, eso es lo que pasa, es lo que vería
So
el
that's what
antropólogo
happens.
marciano que ve a alguien leyendo.
What the Martian anthropologist would say when you
¿De qué se
when
tratan las situaciones
watching you
de
read.
codificación?
So what about coding situations?
Gruesamente,
In
dos
in some,
conjuntos de elementos
two
que son
sets
disjuntos
of elements
pueden asociarse
can be associated in a way that you associate elements from one set with the elements of the other set. Or more interestingly speaking, the domains, operational domains in a system, two different operational states in a system. These are states that arise as a consequence of operations that occur in a system and in the other that can now be associated univocally. For example, the graphic sign and vocalization. Or this speech, a vocal exercise, and subsequent state flow. Because I'm doing a vocal flow and I'm telling Camila, please put your left hand up. Then I do a vocal flow and Camila does an action. A change of states in one domain and a change of states in another domain. How can this happen? How does it happen? Well, there's the parrot coming in.
Here is where the parrot came to play. Yeah, you talk to the parrot and say,
Tú le hablas al loro.
Hola, Dorito. And then the parrot goes and says, hola, Dorito. Hola, Dorito. ¿Por qué hace eso? Primero, ¿cómo hace eso?
Why does the parrot do that? And how does the parrot do that? How can the parrot imitate? It imitates.
So what means imitation? And how can this happen? Imitate.
¿Qué significa la imitación y cómo ocurre la imitación?
Porque resulta ser
It seems that,
maravillosamente,
wonderfully speaking, that this parrot suffers or experiences a hearing disturbance, and now it generates a motor pattern that results in a hearing disturbance equivalent to the one that disturbed him. What happens in the hearing space in the phonetics with the consequences in the phonetic space? These are two operational dimensions in the nervous system which are completely disassembled or discoupled. The same as happens to us all the time, because if I say, Camila, look, Camila, imitate my gesture. She looked at me and she moved her tongue. How can that be? It occurs something visual that is transduced in a motor thing, in a motor space which is completely different to the visual sensual space. How can that happen? Well, like in the parrot. I don't know, and I don't know if anyone knows this, but I'm going to stop sharing the screen. But I can speculate like this. The first time, parrots, they are very sociable entities, and they live in a very rich social environment. And these social interactions are mediated by vocalizations. Vocalizations are the instrument or the vehicle of social articulation, the social behavioral dance of parrots, which is a dance, like all dances in action coordinating are dances. I mean that they have a syntax involved. They have a logic, an inherent logic. Any dance has an inherent logic, a syntax, that it's its own syntax. You don't put 2 feet in the air at the same time because you go down. You don't go from one state to the other at any moment. The state transition rules in dance are very strict. There are rules for transition, states and rules for transitions. In the case of parrots, it's the same. I'm going to explain you how to understand this in a way. The parrots, when you say hello to the parrot says hello, like Carmen. Hi Carmen. When the parrot is saying hello, it is establishing contact vocalization that has to do with the social integration, the identity of the parrot in the social context, in the reference social group. It's called contact vocalization. Is very characteristic. Parrots talks to us, to me, because it's establishing contact vocalization, because they have learned. They learned that in the social reference group, where he is identified with and related to, and where he participates as an individual in this group, with his own particular identity. So that's what makes parrots talk to people. Parrots are doing this contact vocalization in their own social context. In this case, it's with people. How can they do this? Well, this happens like this. The parrot vocalizes, and he hears the auditory consequence of his own vocalization, and it establishes a sort of gallery of states, phonetic states and hearing states which are associated. This motor posture, phonetic motor posture, is associated with this hearing entity as a consequence. If the parrot is deaf, he couldn't learn how to vocalize. A deaf bird cannot learn how to sing. So the parrot establishes a gallery of phonetic states associated to hearing states. These are two operational domains which are different, that are associated in the action. The action of the parrot is the link. And there is a process, mirror neurons in general, and you're gonna hear about this, mirror neurons, that talks about hearing entity and motor entity. They make the coupling. So I have two domains: the domains of the vocal postures, the domain of the hearing resulting entities, and the association. So that when the parrot hears hello, he produces the motor sequence hello, because each element of this sequence hello parrot has a correspondence, an equivalent correspondence in his motor space. Now, when does the parrot says hello parrot, he says as a part of his existence in contact with others. You would say it's the emotion of the contact that leads that, the emission of the vocalization, which is spontaneous in the parrot. Yes. Then you could even say parrot is alone or feels alone each time that vocalizes in the contact vocalization. But that is different, because then contact vocalization should be an expression of the states, and that's different of what we do, because we speak about our states, regardless of the state. I can talk about sadness, and Camila talk about that. Inside, outside, and how am I here, am I there? We can talk about that. We can talk about the states. We can distinguish our own states and talk about without being in them. I can talk about sadness and not being sad, but the parrot cannot, or no one has shown that he can. Maybe he can. It seems they can't. How do we go from parrots to human beings? Let's stop a brief moment, because we don't have much moment in that. Let's stop for a while in there. what is language about?
Es una situación de codificación, pareciera que
It's
sí.
a coding situation.
Cuando yo
It
le
seems
digo,
so.
vamos a hacer un
When I
un
say,
pequeño experimento
let's
mental,
do a
mental.
small mental experiment.
O sea, dense cuenta ustedes que todo lo que los seres humanos
Realize
hacen,
that
todo lo que
everything
hacen
that
como seres
human
humanos tiene
beings
lugar en
do
el
as
lenguaje.
human beings has to do in
La mente y
language
el
is
cuerpo
occurs in language. Mind and
son
body
distinciones en el
are
lenguaje.
distinctions in language.
Todo ¿qué estamos nosotros haciendo en este momento?
Here, what we're doing here
¿Qué hace el
is
filósofo cuando
what
cuando
does
hace su
philosophers
filosofía?
do when they do their own philosophical thinking
¿Qué es lo que
on
hace?
philosophy?
¿Qué hace?
What do they do?
Está
What they do?
realizando
They
un
are
discurso
doing a
del mismo modo
speech.
que yo ahora y
The
ustedes.
same way I'm doing my own speech and you are doing your own speech.
Ahora,
Now,
hagamos el siguiente experimento de
let's do the
imaginación.
following experiment of imagination.
Supónganse ustedes
Let's suppose
que yo
that I'm
estoy en mi
here
oficina en el laboratorio
in my
de la
office
facultad, y la puerta
at the
está
lab
cerrada
in the
ahí,
faculty and the door is
y
closed.
ustedes se acercan y
And you
golpean la puerta y me
approach
dicen,
and knock on the door and
"Oye,
say, hey,
profesor,
professor,
quiero saber esta cuestión del
I
loro, ¿por
want
qué
to
no me
know
explica
this
el
thing
asunto
about the
del loro?"
parrot. Can you explain me this thing about the
Supongamos que
parrot?
alguien
Let's
tiene
say
esa
that
curiosidad, y
someone
ustedes
has this
no la
curiosity.
tenían, y probablemente
Uh,
no la van a tener después que
Maybe
termine,
you
pero
don't have and you wouldn't
sigamos
have
el
it after
juego
this
por un
finishes.
rato,
But let's
supónganse
suppose
que
and
tienen
follow my
curiosidad
game.
por saber la
Let's
cuestión
suppose
del
you're
loro.
curious about the parrot issue.
The loro issue,
The parrot issue.
the loro subject, matter, I don't know how to say it.
The parrot matter, parrot
The
subject. I don't know
loro
how to say
affair.
that.
You want to know the loro
Parrot
affair.
affair.
Okay. So the door is closed. So you go knock and say, hey, Jorge,
La puerta
can
está
you explain me
cerrada. Tú dices,
please
Jorge, ¿me puedes
the
explicar
loro affair?
el tema del
And
loro?
I say to you,
Y yo digo,
well, in
ya,
a moment.
en un momentito,
I will be with you in a moment. So
en,
at
en
that
un
moment,
ratito más.
when I say
En
that,
ese momento,
you
cuando
are
yo digo
imagining
eso,
this, yeah?
¿se están imaginando esto, sí?
With what color is my shirt?
¿De qué color es mi camisa?
Can you say that?
¿Puedes decir eso?
You cannot say it
No puedes decir,
because the door
porque
that
la
you
puerta
imagine
que te imaginas
is dark. Do not allow
es
is opaque-
oscura,
opaque-
opaca
to light.
a la luz.
You imagine a door.
Te imaginas una puerta,
Se imaginaron una puerta, no se imaginaron ni una ventana, ni
you
una
imagine the
pared,
door,
ni un
not a
extraterrestre,
window,
una
not a
puerta.
wall, not an ET, a
Y
door.
la puerta es opaca a la luz.
And the door
Ustedes no
is
ven a través de las
opaque to light,
puertas
and
que
you
se
cannot see
imaginaron.
through doors that you imagined.
Porque la distinción
Because the
puerta
distinction
es
between
opaca
door-
a la luz.
door
Cuando
is
yo
opaque
digo
to light. When I
puerta,
say
y
door,
ustedes oyen puerta
and you
o
hear
al
door,
revés, ocurre en ustedes y en mí
it
un
happens in
estado,
you a
y
state.
ese estado
And
tiene
that state
dimensiones
has the
sensomotoras.
sensomotor dimensions.
Tiene que ver con
It
la
has to do with the
entidad fuerza que
entity,
ustedes
door entity that you
constituyeron en
constituted
sus
in your own
acciones.
actions.
Es
It's
la
a
distinción de un
distinction of a
estado
state
constituido
constituted
en la acción.
in the action.
Las palabras,
The
los
word,
conceptos
the concepts,
son distinciones,
they are distinctions.
digamos,
They are
distinciones de
distinctions
estados
of
configurados en la acción.
states which are configured in the
¿Cómo se
actions.
aprende? Bueno, se aprende en la relación
How do you
social
learn?
de la
Well,
madre
you
con el
learn
niño
in
o
the
quien sea el
social
cuidador del
relationship of
niño o
mother
niña.
and
En
children
un
or
momento de
carer
la
and children,
infancia.
and at the moment of the childhood.
¿Y qué aprende? Porque ahí está
What
el
do
niño o niña
you
en el flujo de
learn?
su
This
existencia.
child is in
Y
the
de
flow of
pronto
his
en
own
su
existence,
relación
and
con
then in the
el otro,
relationship with the carer, with the
el
other,
otro hace un punto ahí,
the other
señala,
does a point there. It
señala,
says,
digamos, puntúa
let's say,
un
it
estado particular de
indicates a
ese flujo.
specific state of
Y lo
this
asocia
flow,
con un
and it associates
estado
this with
particular de su relación,
specific
de la
state of
relación
their own
con la palabra,
relationship
puerta, árbol,
with the word.
casa,
door,
puerta,
tree,
árbol y casa no
home.
se refieren a
Door,
objetos
tree, and
ahí,
home
se
do not
refieren
refer
al
to other
estado
objects.
en el cual
They refer
ese
to the
niño
state in which
está
this
en el
child
momento
is
en que
at the
está, en
moment
el momento
where
de su flujo, en el momento en que ese flujo de
in the
acción, en el
moment
momento
where
del
this
flujo de acciones,
flow
en el cual
of
se encuentra
actions,
inmerso, cuando
where
se
he's
puntuaba
immersed,
su existencia
when
por su
it
relación
was
con el otro.
indicated by
La
the
puerta
existence,
es una
by the
acción,
relationship with the other.
la
Door
taza
is an
es una
action.
acción, la Camila
House is
Valenzuela
an
es una
action.
acción,
Camila Valenzuela
la
is an
Carmen
action.
Cordero es una acción.
Carmen Cordero is an action.
5 más? 5 more?
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Perfect. We are
Yeah.
So, el lenguaje permite la
Language
distinción de
allows the
objetos.
distinction of
Y uno
objects,
hace objetos de
and
todo.
you do objects out of everything.
¿Qué es pensar? ¿Qué es imaginar si no
What
una
is to think,
conversación?
to
Porque-
imagine, but a
Sí, ¿no?
conversation?
Porque yo en el flujo del
Because
lenguaje,
in the
que
flow of
puede estar ahora
language that
representado en
can
esta
be
grafía,
represented by these graphic
yo
signs,
sigo
I
esta
follow
conversación que está aquí
this
representada
conversation
y voy
represented
cambiando de
here,
estado. Porque voy
and
de
I'm
un
changing
estado a
my
otro
state
en una
because I'm
lógica de
going from one state to
transformaciones
the other in a
de estado
transformational
que está
logic of the states
codificada en el
that is
discurso.
coded in the speech, in the discourse.
Porque las transiciones en el discurso
Because transitions in the discourse
tienen la lógica,
have the
representan la
logic
lógica
or
de las
represent
transiciones
the
en el
logic
mundo de
of
las acciones.
transitions in the actions world.
De modo que pensar
So
consiste
that
en una conversación.
thinking consists of a
Imaginar consiste en
conversation.
una conversación.
Imagining
Y todo lo que
is a
ocurre,
conversation,
ocurre
and
como
everything that
instantes o
happens,
momentos en una conversación.
the means instance is in a conversation.
Yo estoy consciente, ¿no?
I'm aware. What is consciousness then?
Yo estoy consciente de cuando estoy consciente
I'm aware
de
of
algo, cuando
when
eso tiene
I
lugar
am
en el
aware
lenguaje
of
como una
something,
distinción
when
en
that
mi flujo de
has to
acciones en el
happen in the
lenguaje.
language as a distinction in my flow of actions in the language.
¿De dónde viene? ¿Cómo es que aparece
Where
ahí?
does
Porque a
it come
veces,
from?
las
And
cuestiones
how does it
aparecen
appear
ahí.
there? Well, things
decir,
they just appear there.
Me
I mean,
acuerdo haber discutido con la Camila
I
muchas
remember
veces la
I talked to
situación
Camila many
del
times about the
flujo, ¿no?
situation
Alguien está
of
jugando tenis, o yo en este momento estoy hablando.
flow. I'm
Y
talking
yo
now.
no sé lo que voy a decir hasta
I
que lo
don't know
diga.
what I'm going to talk about until I say it. The flow.
¿De dónde viene? No sé.
Where does it come
Pero
from?
si
I don't
está,
know.
está en el discurso.
But if it's there, it's in this
Está en la
discourse.
estar en la
It's
conciencia es ser
being in the
distinguido en el
conscience is
lenguaje.
being distinguished in the
No sé de
language.
dónde viene,
I don't know where it comes from,
pero lo veo ocurrir en mí.
but I see
Porque
it
estoy
happen in
oyendo, yo veo
myself
lo que hago.
because
Este es
I'm
un flujo de
hearing. I see
acciones
what I'm doing. This
que
is a flow of
aparece en mí
actions that appear in myself
como acciones en el lenguaje, porque están
as actions in the
distinguidas como
language
acciones en el lenguaje.
because they are distinguished
Aún
as
lo que
actions
uno
in
se
the language.
imagina,
Even
aún lo
even
que
the
no
things you
existe,
imagine, the things that do not exist,
aún lo que uno pudiera llegar a concebir,
those things that you
en el
could
momento en que lo
conceive
concibe, lo
at a certain
concibe
point,
como
at the
un
point you conceive it,
objeto en el
it's
discurso, un
conceived
objeto
as
en el
an
lenguaje.
object in the discourse, as an object in language.
Lo que ocurre más allá
What
del agujero
happens beyond the black hole,
negro es concebido de esa manera.
it's conceived as that.
Yo estoy hablando, no sé lo que
I'm
voy a
talking,
decir,
I don't know what I'm going to say,
pero no sabría si lo dije
but
o no, o si es que no
I
puedo
wouldn't know
distinguir que
whether
eso
I
está ocurriendo.
say it or not
en
if
mí.
I cannot distinguish that this is happening in me.
Es como si lo viera ocurrir
It's
en otro.
like I could see it happening in other.
Resulta ser que yo estoy oyendo el
seems that
discurso que un otro hace, que soy yo mismo.
I'm listening to the discourse
Y
that
en el
someone
momento
else
en
is
que eso
doing that I'm
ocurre,
myself,
como la
and at the
distinción de
moment that that
objetos,
happens is like the
en el
distinction
lenguaje.
of objects
La
in the
distinción de
language.
yo hablando
The
ocurre
distinction
como la
of me
distinción de
speaking
objetos en el lenguaje.
is like the distinction of objects in
De modo que
language.
no puede separarse
So,
conciencia del lenguaje.
You cannot
Conciencia es la distinción de
separate
estar consciente.
conscience from language. Conscious is the distinction of being conscious.
Y no hay manera
There's no way of being out
Y
of
yo
that.
creo además
And I
que no hay
believe
ninguna
that
necesidad.
there's no need
To go outside or inside.
to go outside or inside.
But you know, that is my preference.
That's my preference.
¿Se acabaron los 5?
Se acabaron.
Are the 5 minutes finished? Yes, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So I don't know if something of this have meaning for you.
No sé si algo de esto tiene sentido, pero he tratado al menos
Thank you
de
very
hacerlo.
much.
Okay, thank you very
Muchas
much.
gracias.